When the judgment of Paris were nine judges, all French, blindly picked two California wines over the French elite in 1976. It sent shockwaves through the industry.
Altro manca. Signora. Vederci. Ah, ok. Bravo, sai che non me lo ricordo. Prosecco. Allora non ce l'ho. C'ho crema. I'm Wendy Holloway, and this is Flavor of Italy, sharing the very best of Italian food and wine, lifestyle, and culture. This is Wendy Holloway with Kevin Ferguson. And as you all know, I'm a podcaster. And I was just saying to Kevin, I also have my YouTube, which is just a few months old. And I'm over 300 episodes. I do a lot of interviews with authors, especially food and wine. Italian food and wine is a focus of mine, but a lot of Italian American topics, which I'm fascinated by, just how certain Italians got to the United States and end up doing the amazing things that they do. And that's what we mentioned we were going to be talking about today is this incredible story of Kevin Ferguson's grandpa and relatives who went to the States and opened not just a winery and not right away on the East Coast, all the way over to the West Coast. It was an outstanding winery. But
Yeah.
so basically, I'm going to interrogate you, Kevin, ask you lots of questions so
Absolutely.
everyone,
Bring
yeah,
it on.
yeah, I will. First of all, what inspired you to write this book about your family and their story as Italian immigrants? What inspired you?
Yeah, so that actually so the winery and the family is so obviously my name's Ferguson, but it's on my mother's side. It's the Gemello side. And my grandfather was Mario Gemello, who ran the Gemello Winery in, of all places, Silicon Valley in Mountain View for 50, actually 60 years. He helped his father, my great grandfather, launch the winery at the end of Prohibition and in the depths of the Great Depression. The country was still rising from the ashes of the Great Depression. When my grandfather got diagnosed with prostate cancer, we knew that, or we didn't know how much time he had. So I decided to come back and be close to him in the San Francisco Bay Area. I met with him on a weekly basis, just chronicling his story. We had three or four old cassette tapes that my great grandfather had recorded his stories about the old days, his immigration to California from Italy, northern Italy, Piedmont in 1912, and then the challenges of launching the winery and pivoting during Prohibition. This period when I was chronicling the stories and meeting with my grandfather, that was in 2002. When he passed away in 2005 during the pandemic lockdown, my grandmother, his widow, who was 99 years old, we needed not really a caregiver, but a supervisory caregiver to make sure that she didn't take the car out for a spin. So, because we had to lay off her caregivers until we had a vaccine. And so I became that. Me and my mom ended up splitting time, and the way that I was convinced to do it was my brother said, "You can resurrect that book that you were writing about grandpa, and you can spend the time going through the newspaper clippings and talking to grandma." And so I thought, okay, I'll do that. And that's 2000, obviously 2020, and Substack was really just kind of starting. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to start writing more about the book and releasing either early release chapters or behind the scenes process of writing the book. And 5 years later, I don't know how many issues or posts I've posted, but I've been publishing 2 to 4 times a month. It's about 90% done, and I'm hoping to get it published, if not at the end of the year, early next year. There's been a little bit of a pivot. The winery it does have a pretty extraordinary arc in the winery aspect because when my grandfather was towards the end of his, actually, I think it was in 2002, there was a reenactment of the Judgment in Paris, the famous wine tasting that put California wines on the international map. And my grandfather's wine, he didn't even know that it was entered. And it's actually a funny story how it got entered. He ended up winning, and the way that it came about. So the when the Judgment of Paris were nine judges, all French, blindly picked two California wines over the French elite in 1976. It sent shockwaves through the industry, and it was all over in every. There was only one reporter there. Time magazine sent George Tabor, who was the European correspondent, and the organizer, Stephen Spurrier, had pitched it to all the French media, and they universally rejected the story idea because they all figured that France was going to win. And if France is going to win, there's no story there. And when two California wines blindly ended up winning the contest, and Time magazine in 1976 had 20 million subscribers. And so when it was published, it made huge news because California was still reeling from the effects of prohibition. Prohibition was in at least the reputation of California wine, which they've been dealing with the reputation repair for 40 years. And that was such a big deal because from 1920 to 1933, during prohibition, the sale of alcohol was outlawed. But not only that, there was no all the universities that taught viticulture stopped teaching viticulture. The people who worked in the industry either transitioned into other fields or moved to Europe to work. And so there was a massive brain dump or brain loss of
Mm.
winemaking. And nobody really thought that California could hold a candle to France. And lo and behold, California knocked them off. And every time and the French were not happy, obviously not happy about that. And so every time a reporter would go to Bordeaux, one particular one, Mark Golodetz, who was writing for Wine Enthusiast magazine, he would get complaints lodged at him about the way that the Judgment in Paris was held, the types of wines that were chosen, the wines were too young, so on and so forth. So Mark Golodetz decided to do something about it, and he decided to stage a 25th anniversary rematch. And when I spoke to him a year or two ago, he said that I promised I was only going to pick the best wines from both regions. And then a fluke accident happened when he was boxing up his wines for the tasting. He broke a bottle of Mondavi Reserve,
Ooh.
and he needed a replacement. And he needed something that fit the criteria. It needed to be a 1970 Cabernet from California. And he had been drinking
Mm.
the wine for quite a while. It was his house wine. He had a couple of cases that a friend who was a wine importer gave to him, or maybe he bought it off him. And he was curious how it would do up against these heavyweights. And so he put it into the tasting. And soon after that, my grandfather's phone started ringing, and it was the media. So he
Wow.
got a call from Ray Isle, among others. Ray Isle is now the executive editor of Food and Wine magazine, but at the time he was at Wine and Spirits magazine. And my grandfather was long retired. He was 85 years old. He was in his garden, as all Italians do. They have a gardening fixation. And so Ray Isle said, "Hey, are you familiar with the Judgment of Paris?" And he said, "Yeah, of course." And he goes, "They had a rematch. And again, a California wine won." And my grandfather said, "That's amazing. Why are you telling me?" And he goes, "This time it wasn't a wine from Napa. It was a wine from Mountain View. It was your 1970 Cabernet." My grandfather was like just blown away. And like I said, he didn't even know it was entered. And he would end up living for another 3 years, and he would probably tell this story 50 to 100 times. And he was going through chemo, And finally, in 2005, the chemo wasn't working, and he ended up. I'm sitting with him at his after his last round of chemo 2 weeks before he passed away, and he asked me to bring him that article. He wanted to read it one last time
Oh, that's lovely. There was an article in Time magazine about this.
about the original tasting in 1976. The one that my grandfather won was in 2001, 2002.
I guess I have to back up even further. What
Absolutely.
brought your grandpa to the United States? He's from Piedmont.
Yep. Yeah, so he was born in 1880, 1881. So Italy was only 20 years old. And or I think it was 1882. So he's 21. The country was 22, 21 years old. And he was a jack of all trades. He was at 13, he was pruning a vineyard. He was running a team of oxen. In his early 20s, he ended up working at Martini and Rossi Sparkling Vineyard, and which I think in California, it's really well known for its the vermouth that they make, even 100 years later. And in the evenings, he had his own vineyard.
Your grandpa's family was in the wine business?
Yeah, my great grandfather,
Your
he
great grandpa, yeah.
great grandfather, and but 3 out of 4 winters would wipe out his crops. The harsh winters would wipe out his crops. And this was a period where it was there, Italy, at least certain regions, things were rough. In fact, certain times he would go to France and work in the mines. He also worked in Germany in the mines whenever he could make a buck. And he had friends from Italy who immigrated to California who would write him letters telling him, look, we're making $1 a day. You're making 10 cents a day. You should come and join us. Ultimately, he did. He left his wife and first daughter and boarded a ship and came out to California in 1912 around Christmas time. And he landed a job at Almaden Vineyards, which was famous, famously run by Paul Masson, a famous French maker and champagne maker. He was known as the champagne king of California. And when he and he told his wife that he was going to send for her when he had the money. And after he completed a big project one day, he went to go blow off steam at an Italian watering hole in in San Jose, California. And he bumps into somebody he knew from Piedmont. And the guy's name is Giovanni Beltramo, which for 5 generations on the San Francisco Peninsula, there was a well-known liquor store called the Beltramo Wine and Spirits liquor store. It was run by 5 generations of Beltramos, and he was
Hmm.
the patriarch of that lineage. And he came 20 or 30 years before my great grandfather, and he bumps into my great grandfather and he goes, Gemello, I didn't know you were here. And he goes, where's your family? And he goes, I had to leave them behind and I'm going to send for them when I had the money. That struck a chord with Beltramo because he had to leave his wife behind and he sent for her when he had the money. So he offered my great grandfather $190 for a first class ticket for his wife and daughter to come join him. That's the equivalent of well over $5,000 today.
So then he went there because of wine. He stayed in the wine business. And then the winery was extremely successful. Why doesn't it exist any longer? What happened?
Yeah, he launched so the winery, he had to pivot. So he worked for Parmesan and then he worked for the Pichetti Winery. And then when Prohibition hit, he had his own vineyard up on Monte Bello Road, which is a famous wine district mountain. And he ended up selling his vineyard in 1919 as we were sliding into Prohibition. Prohibition had been looming for 30 years, but finally picked up steam in the teens, 1915, 1917. It finally went into law in 1920. And so he had to pivot and he ended up going into the technology of the day. which was cars. So he went along with a couple of business partners and they bought a fleet of trucks and they ended up developing basically a traveling farmers market, delivering vegetables house to house throughout the South Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. And if you go to Silicon Valley now, it's wall to wall apartment complexes and strip malls and so forth. But back in those days, all the homes were spaced out in between all these orchards. And so you needed a massive truck to deliver vegetables. And in 1925, right in the middle of Prohibition, he was able to buy 30 acres in Mountain View in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley for $30,000. And that would become the Gemello Winery when
Mm.
Prohibition was repealed in 1933. December 1933, he was open for business in 1934. And my grandfather, Mario Gemello, he was 17 years old in high school, senior in high school, and he helped him launch the family, which launched the winery. And then he ended up taking it over 10 years later when my grandfather, great grandfather, semi retired. My
Yeah.
grandfather took it on for the next 40 years. I guess getting back to your original question, why doesn't it exist anymore? Is when he retired, when my grandfather retired, 1982, he sold it to my cousins, the Obisters, Sandy and Paul Obister, who had their own winery in Half Moon Bay. But they started that winery when they were, I don't know if you would say close to retirement, but it was Paul Obister, my great grandfather, I guess his great grandson in law. He
Mhm.
worked in tech, he worked at IBM, and then he ended up starting this winery with Sandy Obister, his wife, in 1978, which was actually 2 years after the Judgment in Paris when there was this huge demand for California wines. And this was the launching pad of the boutique wineries, such as Obister Winery. So he
Right.
sold it
Right.
to Paul and Sandy Obister, but when they retired in 2002, that's where there was nobody to take it over to a family lineage. And so they sold it to a winery that became Nibia, and then I think it's been sold again. So
Have you been to visit it?
visit, yeah. So I grew up running around in the orchards and the Gemello
Oh,
Winery
okay.
as a child in the 70s. I was always there riding the forklift as a 5-year old and got my first taste of wine from the barrel and so forth.
So you never had the inspiration to have a winery of your own, for example. It seems like you were really just born and bred into that whole generations of winemaking.
Yeah, I think it would have happened if the timing was more right. When I was in college, I went to college studying journalism and became a newspaper reporter. And then when my grandfather retired at when I was probably around 30, I was still writing. And the idea of writing a book about him was appealing, but I didn't really think of even the idea of wanting to make my own wine until I've never done it, but it never was alluring to me until as I'm writing this book, which is more recent. And now I don't have the resources or the opportunities to, it's not like I can go to the Obister winery anymore and, oh, teach me what you know. I
But you still have your grandpa's wife.
Yes, during the pandemic lockdown, that's when I was going through the newspaper clippings, and she was 99 at the time. And I would sit there and have conversations with her, have her fill in some blanks if there was anything that she knew that I didn't know. It dawned on me that I might be missing a bigger story here. It's
Yeah.
maybe the story is about Grandma Kay's longevity. And
Yeah.
so she was 99 and we were planning her 100th birthday. And we had been talking to the San Francisco Giants about her. She got a letter in the mail from the New England Centenarian Study. And they said, "We're excited about your plans for your birthday. We want you to be part of our study." And she's been part of the New England Centenarian Study where they research her DNA, her habits, her environment, and it gets accumulated with 3,000 other centenarians that they've studied so that they can identify common practices, common habits, common DNA, so that they can identify what makes them so unique.
And now she has just turned 104, right?
105. She turned 105 last week.
Was she able to share any unique stories with you about the winery and
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Up until probably about 102, she was pretty sharp.
getting back to your book then, you're looking now for an agent and a publisher. It's your manuscript is 90% done. And
There's always new things that I'm like, "Oh my god, I have to put that in there."
yeah.
Any of my friends who say, "God, Kevin's been saying it's been 90% done for a long time." I think it's going to be 90% until a publisher says, "Okay, that's it. We want it. Or let's do it."
Exactly. So the name of the book is Rain on the Monte Bello Ridge. And again, Kevin Ferguson's the author, and everyone who's enjoying this conversation, go to Kevin's Substack and you'll find out just a little bit about me and writing this. And yeah,
It might be interesting on some people listening or watching this might be going, "What does rain on the Monte Bello Ridge mean?" And there is obviously a story there that ties to 2002 when I was going through the cassette tapes with my grandfather and listening to my great grandfather tell these stories. And when he got the loan from Beltramo to send for his wife, he got a job at Piedmont Winery, and his bachelor days in California were coming to an end. So he needed a new place to stay and a bigger place where he can, for his wife and daughter to live with him. And the Piquettis had another house that they could rent just off of the property of the winery. And my great grandfather was telling the story on the cassette tape, and he had a heavy Italian accent. So our process for transcribing these tapes is we would listen to a portion of it, we'd stop the tape, my grandfather would repeat what my great grandfather had said, and I would type it into my computer. And so my grandfather said after a while, he retold the story. He mentioned that the guy was the reason why that the house was vacant was because there was poison oak all over the place, and the guy who was gonna rent it got spooked by the poison oak. And so my great grandfather said, "I'll rent it. I don't have any problem with poison oak." And Grandpa Mario said, "I don't think you have to put all that. That's just trivial details. Just put that they moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915." I thought those details were trivial too. And then Grandpa Mario said, "He also said it rained for 4 days. I don't think you have to put that either." And I said, "Wait a second. You said it. Now all these details are making sense." And he goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "Think about it. He had been away from his wife for a year. He comes and then she comes to live with him. They move in on New Year's Eve, 1915, and it rains for 4 days. 8 months and 27 days later, you were born."
there you go.
So that's
Well,
where the name comes
yeah,
from.
yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And definitely have a look at Kevin's Substack and keep your eye out for his book, Rain on the Monte Bello Ridge. Hmm.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
And yeah,
Kevin.
this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed
Yeah,
being part of it.
yeah, me too. Absolutely.
This has been Flavor of Italy. Find us on www.flavorofitaly.com and on Substack, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, always as Flavor of Italy.